In this episode of Deconstructing the Home Show, we are going to be talking about highest and best use for property. Now, I know this is a term I've mentioned in previous episodes, but I thought it was worth going back over and expanding upon because how you look at a property and whether you are buying it for its present use or converting it to the highest and best use will affect where you buy properties, the price you pay, a lot of different factors. So, first off, what is the highest and best use of a property? What does that term mean? And basically that term means that when you look at a piece of real estate, there's obviously, it's either not being used at all, it's currently being used in some capacity, or it's currently at its highest and best use. And highest and best use can change over time, but you will pretty obviously know when a property is being used for its highest and best use. There'll be maximum number of cars, the density will be at its correct amount. You look at an H-E-B shopping center in South Texas where I work and develop, and that property is being used in its highest and best use. There's incredible density. The amount of revenue that's being generated per square foot is extremely high. It's used by lots of people throughout different times of the day. The property is at its highest and best use, which is a good thing. That's where you'll be maximizing revenue or the price you can sell the property for as a developer. So you are pursuing the highest and best use for property. And for a single family rehab and flip, the highest and best use is saying, hey, how dilapidated is this property? What are the current standards for how this house and property should be in its location in the city, and then what do you have to do to take it from where it is currently to where it needs to go? And so you are taking this residential property. So when you're rehabbing a property, you are taking a residential home and converting it from a dilapidated old use to the highest and best use where you'll have the maximum number of people who want to purchase and live in that house. So that's for a single family home, and that's fairly easy to determine, but it gets a little more tricky when you look at a single family home that's been used as single family and maybe the entire use has now changed. And so what does that mean? So if a use has changed for a property, that means something that was used for one thing, that is, so let's say a family living in a property, that may no longer be the best use for that property. And that happens because city growth changes, right? And so this may now be in a much more commercial or even industrial area. It might be on a very large piece of property that is nice for a home, but is that necessarily the only thing that can be done with a property that's on 2 or 3 acres in the middle of a city is only having one family live there? Probably not best for the density that's usually created in a center city area. So then you got to look back and say, okay, so I have this property. So you bought the property. So I'm under contract on a piece of property right now and looking at a couple others that are a house in a center city area on a larger piece of land. This is a perfect example. And so this property was either combined with several lots were combined, the owner bought them, or it just started out as a large piece of property, which many city areas did, and they've gotten smaller and smaller as more people want to live in that area and the land becomes more valuable. So I am now trying to figure out what is the highest and best use of this single family house on this large piece of land. And most likely that will mean demolishing or moving the house if it's worth salvaging, and then either doing multifamily, doing a higher single family development, so lots of smaller homes on a very small piece of land. That's called urban infill housing. Doing something that's multifamily, which single family housing kind of is multifamily when it's super dense, but this would actually be like an apartment or condominium complex, or doing something commercial or industrial. Usually it's going to be commercial if it's, again, in a centralized city area. Industrial usually has more waste, more byproducts. Those are moving out of the city. They're usually moved to the suburbs, the outlying areas. That's where the land is cheaper. Usually industrial needs more land than just one warehouse. So if you're going to buy 5 or 10 acres in the middle of a city, that's going to be extremely expensive. So usually your uses are going to be converted from something that's single family or single family with land to something more industrial or dense with multifamily. And so again, determining that is based off city growth. You want to be able to look ahead, and so you're going to get the good deals when you're able to look and say, okay, this property is not, the highest and best use is its current use. So I have a single family home that I'm able to say, hey, in 3 years or 5 years down the road, this area can be redeveloped into multifamily or commercial property. It doesn't need to stay this way, but people aren't thinking that. This is how large developers, gas stations, large national restaurant chains, this is how they buy land. They are able to look, Walmart, this is absolutely how Walmart buys land. They look into the future and they buy land 5 to even 15 to 20 years before they say, hey, this is probably where this area is going. And we can acquire the land for literally pennies on the dollar at this point, but there's going to be dramatic appreciation in the cost of this land, and the availability is going to decrease dramatically as this area becomes more and more dense. So if we want a 5-acre piece of property for our store, we need to buy that now and hold it. And the one thing to think about starting off, and I've done this with several pieces of property. So I own a fourplex that its current highest and best use is it's 4 little houses on there. But in the not too distant future, the highest and best use will probably be a much denser apartment complex, with me acquiring a couple of the adjacent properties and putting probably 50 to 70 units down there. I own a building downtown that was used as a bakery for years. It got burned out. There was a fire. It was sold dramatically less than it's going to be worth. It was still more than the actual building was worth, though. I paid triple the appraised value of the property at that time, but that's because I could say, okay, I can reconvert this into most likely a restaurant, bar area, and I will be able to rent or sell that property for significantly more than I purchased it for or will put into the property. So I'm able to look far enough down the road and say, I can pay more now because it's going to be worth that later on. There's another piece of property that I own that's on a busy commercial corridor that's currently being used as residential. Again, probably not the best use, and probably dense residential isn't the best use either. It's probably something commercial, so I'm looking ahead at doing that. This is a really powerful tool because you're able to pay what people are willing to happily sell you the property for, because you're able to look further down the road and see what it's going to be worth. But again, if you're just starting out, don't get too caught up in a long-term buy and hold strategy. That's an expensive game to play that can make you tons of money. It just costs a lot to play that way. So figure out properties that have a use that's producing income for you now, which enables you to have that hold. And if it's tying up a lot of your cash, don't do the deal, because cash now, money now that you're able to use, is worth double, triple, many times what it's going to be worth further down the road.